the best way to understand the word spirit in the Bible is our word consciousness today. That spirit is divine and human consciousness that is in all people, but it comes in various forms of awakening, and this would apply to a Buddhist or an atheist or anyone.
You're listening to the Contemplative Light podcast with your host, Clint Sabon.
Hey, and welcome to the Contemplative Light podcast. Contemplative Light is a community of interfaith spiritual teachers rooted in the Christian contemplative tradition, providing resources for the healing of persons. Contemplative Light, mystical practice, inner transformation. This podcast is brought to you by our course on contemplative practices. You can visit us at contemplativelight.com and click on our courses to learn more about our on-demand teachings about the rich mystical practices of the Christian tradition. So in this episode, I had the honor of interviewing Paul Smith, who wrote the book Integral Christianity and recently now has a new book out. And so we talked about those things and also his just work in general. He's frequently referred to by Ken Wilber. I discovered him that way, actually, in reading The Religion of Tomorrow and listening to Ken's talks a little bit. And I was really blown away by Paul. He has some very rich offerings about being able to integrate the higher state stages in integral development. In the Christian tradition, it would have been what would have been called illumination and divine union, and he has a way of talking about those that don't really sacrifice all the nuances of integral theory with traditional Christian theology. Because I've talked to so many people that thought that the two were just incompatible, and I've even had people very, very just adamant. No, you can't have an integral Christianity. If it's integral, it's not going to be Christian. If it's Christian, it's not going to be integral. And I think Paul kind of convinced me otherwise. So stay tuned. Listen.
Hey, Paul. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, Clint. Nice to hear from you.
Yeah. I'm really honored to have you on to our podcast and to interview you. I've recently begun diving deeper into integral thought and how it applies to Christianity, and your name always comes up. So, just really grateful to have you on here and talk with us about your new book. Did you want to tell listeners that aren't familiar with you and your work a little bit about your work and a little bit about your new book?
Sure. I've been a pastor of a church pastored the same church for 49 years and retired about 6-7 years ago. And during the time at that church, I would continue to evolve and grow spiritually. And fortunately, most of the time, the church would move along with me. And so out of that, most recently came the experience with Ken and integral philosophy or theory or perspective. And so I began teaching my understanding, interpreting Ken's framework of integral philosophy into Christianity. Began teaching that to my congregation, and it really seemed to help them. And of course, it had really revolutionized my life. Matter of fact, about 20 years ago, one thing I often do is I'll reread the Gospels and the Gospel of Thomas, just all in sort of one setting, and just let that soak into me, and see if I see any new patterns or pictures or anything. And I had done that, and what came to me was 12 words, and they really embedded themselves in me and really deepened my spiritual life quite dramatically. And the 12 words were: Jesus talked about God, to God, and as God, so can we. And I realized as I saw that and wrote that down, that was a reflection of what I'd also been learning from Ken Wilber, who is a great pattern recognizer, except he recognizes quite universal and intellectual and esoteric and patterns of every kind all put together. And it's what he called the three basic perspectives in life that we have upon every situation, which is first person, second person, and third person. Actually, we learned it in grade school, and what I was echoing when I said Jesus talked about God and to God and as God is that Jesus had a third person relationship with God and talking about God, and a second person relationship with God, a we space relationship where he related to God, and he had a first person relationship with God in that he identified within himself that he and God were one, and carried that identification out in his mission and his ministry. And then I believe the essence of the Christian life is to have the same kind of relationship with God that Jesus had, and to manifest it in the world according to our gifts. And so that's what some of us call the three faces of God. I called it in my previous book, the infinite face of God, the God that's beyond us, and the intimate face of God, the God that's beside us, and the inner face of God, the God that's being us. And all three are incredibly important and wonderful, and were life-changing for me. It gave me permission to develop a relationship with God that was much vaster and deeper and than ever before, and at the same time more intimate and personal. And at the same time, my own deepest identity, I realized, was being created in the image of God, and therefore my job was to become who I already was, which is a child of God, made in the image of God, and that both Jesus and I were children of God and made in that same image. He just owned his image and expressed it more, and mine's a little more covered over with ego and a bunch of other stuff. And but anyway, that became the framework for my next 20 years of teaching and experiencing God in my own personal practice of prayer and meditation, reflection, and it's been just an amazing journey. And so in my most recent book, which is titled Is Your God Big Enough, Close Enough, You Enough? Jesus and the Three Faces of God, I take 300 or 400 pages and explain all that in much greater detail. But it's been quite revolutionary and changing for me. And you know, those three dimensions of God are the dimensions that Christianity is all divided up over. You know, you have evangelicals who talk about a relationship with God, And you have moderns and postmoderns who talk about the God that's beyond us and mystery and unknowing. And you have the Eastern Orthodox, which talks about deification and theosis, that we're becoming like God. And they each have a piece of the truth. And I think what integral does is it integrates. And it integrates all three faces of God together so we can have all three dimensions and not just be limited to one dimension. So that's a little outline.
Sure, it's wonderful stuff, and I feel it's certainly essential, especially going up to the higher state stages, and as we begin in the awakening process, the contemplative process. I find a lot of people, including myself, have had difficulties trying to understand and integrate the fact that I feel as you experience more and more of the divine presence in the here now, the God as an external almost seems to not be so external or external in any way at all. And I guess this 3-2-1 of the Trinity, three faces of God, is certainly a good model of kind of making sense of that.
Jesus experienced God external to him. That is, when he talked with Abba, he wasn't talking to himself. He was talking to the presence of his daddy, his heavenly Father, that was next to him and with him. And at the same time, when he said he and God were one, and he spoke as God, that was a different face. And at the same time, when he used the word God, he was talking about the God of Moses and the God who said, "I am that I am," or "I'm infinite being." And so he had all three relationships, and he held them all together. He didn't see them as conflicted. I used to ask myself, well, let's see, was Jesus talking to himself when he prayed? How did that work? And so I find that I can, if I embrace all three, they are all very, very valid. The meditative dimension, the centering prayer movement, is wonderful. It's a reaction against traditional prayer, which exclusively sees God as sitting up there in the clouds, acting like Zeus, sometimes angry and sometimes mad. And we have to let go of that. But we don't have to let go of God who appears beside us as Jesus is like a father, and for Christians, also like Jesus. And so I find that people who only do centering prayer usually have decided not to pray. They've just decided to meditate.
Right.
Yeah, they moved into and it's wonderful to move into a higher transcendent state of what I call an empty mind and a full heart, where you experience the vastness and the infinite consciousness of God, and that is wonderful. But it's also wonderful then to talk to God, to have a relationship with God, because we're relational creatures, and we relate to one another, and we relate to God as personal. So God is at least personal, transpersonal, and but that's been neglected. And so I find I know somebody said the other day that in centering prayer, someone had said, if the Virgin, you're trying to do contemplative centering prayer, and the Virgin Mary appears to you, you say to her, "Look, go away now. I've got to meditate, not now." And what I want to say to that is, well, why not do both? If Mary appears to you, why not talk with her?
Right.
And if Jesus appears to you, why not talk with him? Why not open your heart to him and have a relationship? And at the same, you can also move into union with him and oneness with him, where you move into a more transcendent state. So I find all three states of everyday consciousness, subtle consciousness, and transcendent consciousness all throughout the Bible. The Bible is full of mystical experiences, and they're all there, and I don't want to neglect any of them.
Sure. That's great. Little anecdote about the Virgin Mary there. I was imagining like Buddha meditating in the garden and being like, oh, it's just emptiness. It's just, it's just a mirage. Just let it pass. And it's like doing that as a Christian all of a sudden sounds a little bit wacky.
Well, but there's an element of that. That is that when we get in touch with the infinity of transcendent causal awareness inside of ourselves, there is an unknowing or a beyond form and beyond knowledge that sometimes is called emptiness, and it's not empty. It's full of love and bliss and joy and peace, but it's a wonderful thing. It's just not people and forms and pictures and so on. But yet we can also experience in prayer visions and talking to God, talking to Jesus, or if you have other spiritual guides like Jesus had. Jesus had Moses and Elijah as two of his spiritual guides. He knew Moses frowned upon talking to the dead, but he went ahead and talked to Moses and Elijah, who'd been dead for a long time. And that was the second person. That was prayer. That was him talking to two spiritual beings who were giving him guidance about his upcoming, in Greek it's Exodus, which would be the crucifixion. And so Jesus was experiencing that relational element with Moses and Elijah. So I want to include all those. All those have a truth in them, and not exclude any of them. So my daily time, mostly an hour every day, I spend so much time reading and reflecting about the Bible that I do that at other times. And then in my own daily time, sometimes I will start off with, if I sense the presence of Jesus very strongly, usually it's Jesus, I feel Jesus next to me on my right side, touching my arm almost constantly. I feel that right now. And I will just acknowledge his presence, and we may talk, I may say some things, and then I may hear some things back, and I may just sit in his energy field, his presence. One of my favorite verses from the Gospel of Thomas is Jesus said, "Whoever drinks from my mouth, I will become like that person, and that person will become like me, and hidden things will be revealed to them." And so I think that's the essence of prayer contemplation time, which is we drink from the mouth of Jesus. We acknowledge his presence. We sense him with us. We hear his words. We talk with him. And amazingly, as we do that, we become more like him. And incredibly, can you imagine it? He becomes more like us. I think what that means is we see that we really are like Jesus. Jesus was fully human and fully divine, and so are we. And then Thomas says, "And hidden things will be revealed." And from that place of causal consciousness, we begin to see the world in a new way, and we move into oneness, or the realm of God, the kingdom of God that Jesus talked about, which is we see there's no separation between people or between anything. We're all one. We're not all the same, but we're all one.
Right.
I covered a lot of territory there, didn't I?
Yeah, you really did, and I'd like to key in on a specific point, and
sure.
I hope it's not too specific, but it's a personal curiosity of mine, which is in Religion of Tomorrow, Wilber talks about like the transition, I guess, between causal and non-dual, and there's the phase of kind of witness and then emptiness and then kind of the empty witness and going in that phase. And one time as an example, I wrote a blog post trying to illustrate the state stages in St. John of the Cross. And when I started getting into the higher stuff and I would get into that empty witness, a few people responded to the blog like, I can't tell if this person's really a Christian, and so I guess the question is, for you, how do you understand that, like, I guess in the framework of everything you've mentioned so far, and theologically, when you get to that transition point where there is that kind of some sort of transition between without and within and a kind of empty witness where you want the witness to be completely empty, and yet we're Christians, and emptiness isn't necessarily always compatible with our theological framework.
Yes, that's really true, and I'm with you on. I love Ken's recent book on the religion of tomorrow, and one reason I love it is because he goes into higher stages of consciousness in a more profound way than I've seen him before. Well, I think. First of all, I need to own that I've come to understand the Bible talking about spirit. The word ruach in the Old Testament, in Hebrew, and the pneuma in the Greek in the New Testament is a very, very rich word, which loses a lot in translation. And in the Old Testament, spirit, or pneuma, or ruach rather, is given to all people as the breath of life. So all people are considered to have God's spirit, because God breathes the spirit of life into every living creature and every living person. And so it seemed to me as I began to see that, I thought, well, how do they equate spirit with somebody being alive? And it seemed very clear. If a person was conscious and moving around and active, they were filled with God's spirit. And if they were dead and they weren't conscious, God's spirit had left and gone on. And so they associated spirit and breath and wind and life all together in that one word, ruach. And then there were a few people in the Old Testament who had sort of an extra dose of this spirit. And as I read those accounts, it looked like simply these were people who moved into states of higher consciousness. They were more alive and more awake. And then I moved to the New Testament and saw that when the Spirit came at Pentecost, these were people who suddenly came alive in what today we would call a higher consciousness. Their consciousness moved up into a trance state to subtle and causal levels, and you can see this throughout the New Testament. And so I made a decision that the best way to understand the word spirit in the Bible is our word consciousness today. That spirit is divine and human consciousness that is in all people, but it comes in various forms of awakening, and this would apply to a Buddhist or an atheist or anyone who can have spiritual experiences of higher consciousness. And so when I say the Spirit came upon, I'm reading, say, in Revelation that John says, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. He's simply saying, in today's language, I was in a higher state of consciousness, and I saw these things. And so that alone puts those higher stages in the realm of the sacred and the divine, or whatever word you want to use. If you're an agnostic, you can call it the ultimate source or the great mystery or whatever. Christians call it God, and we see Jesus is revealing that in a wonderful way, but it's not limited to Christianity. So I think the Spirit is working in the world in every person, and wants everyone to be awakened. So when Buddha awakened under the Bodhi tree, he was experiencing a higher stage of consciousness, which we would see in the New Testament is what happened to Christians when they were filled with the Spirit. They moved into a higher state of consciousness, and we interpret that experience by our stage of growth and by our theology and by the language of our culture. So Buddha, who was quite annoyed at all the God talk in his culture, didn't have much use for talking about God. He didn't find it helpful. So he did not use God language. Christians don't have that problem, although we have distorted God greatly. So we're free to use God language. But I see it all as that's God at work in the world and everyone and every place. And a higher consciousness is what God is after, because it's from there that we have the interchange in our hearts and our minds that allows us to see that there really is no separation between any of us, and there's no separation between us and God, and that we're all one, and then manifest that in the world so that there's a movement towards unity and peace and oneness. So does that get anything you were asking there?
Oh, that gets it all. That's certainly a game changer. I want to thank you for that way of articulating it, because now it's looking at Wilber's stages and comparing them to my own experiences, and just kind of looking at mysticism in general. All of a sudden, the coast is kind of clear. For Christians,
you got it.
To go all the way. Yeah, you
got it. That's right.
Yeah. So
isn't that wonderful?
It is, and it's a relief. It's a relief.
That's exactly what I felt. I felt like, what a relief.
Yeah. Right. I don't have
Good way of putting it. Good way.
Yeah. So. And the Spirit, I guess, going into those deeper stages, I guess it is really just kind of a matter of awakening to that Spirit and awakening to being one with that Spirit, and then awakening and totally, fully integrating the fact that the Spirit is you, Spirit is me, and Spirit is here now all the time, and that's all it is. Yeah.
Yes.
Very, very similar way to the way... many enlightened people talk about it. This is just still within the confines of Christian orthodoxy, really. I mean, you've really pulled it off, Paul.
well, of course, some people think I'm a heretic, but that's
course.
okay.
Yeah. But you're. Yeah, I mean, they haven't stoned you yet.
Well, I don't know about that.
Okay,
but that's okay, because it is really life changing to move into what we're talking about, and we can go all the way, and we may use different language describe it. But our hearts, when our hearts are awakened and our minds are opened and higher levels of consciousness, we can see and sense truth, even if it isn't spoken in our language, spoken in our culture, our Christian culture, or whatever it is. And so it's a wonderful thing. God is everywhere, and we Christians can offer our way of articulating it, and our Buddhist friends can offer their way of articulating it, and all loving religions and all loving traditions have a piece of that truth, and we can learn from them all. And I don't need to stop being a Christian in order to learn from others. I can go deep as a Christian, which then allows me to learn from any path.
Sure, and ultimately, I suppose it's all just words, anyways, because the ultimate truth is only something to be experienced and not to be experienced with the same faculties in us that think. But I guess working backwards, we can do that too, and then we can work ourselves all the way backwards consistently enough to end up back in church just on any given Sunday.
Well, yeah. Although I do understand as Christians progress and move from a traditional form of Christianity, it gets harder and harder to be in a church service that uses language that you no longer feel appropriate. And the words to the hymns are all about God, He, and God is as if God were a male. And I was listening to Barbara Bush's funeral service, a beautiful service. Oh, I love the music. But then they all recited the Apostles' Creed, and I thought, oh gosh, it's there's some of that doesn't make any sense today. It's phrased in a centuries old Greek way of thinking that doesn't fit today, and so a lot of my friends have trouble sitting through a church service where they're asked to recite that because they don't believe it in that way anymore, and I can understand that. So I think what the Spirit is doing today is seeing new forms of church emerge, and we can then stop being mad at our old church. Like you said, we can end up back at a church service and see the truth and the goodness and the beauty in it. And even if we don't all agree with always the way they phrase things and say things, but still there's a need for new forms to come out and new things. And you're on the edge of that. What you're doing with your podcast is you're helping people look at a larger, more inclusive, more loving, a broader, integrated framework and pattern, and then pointing to experience, which is where it has to come to rest. We have to be able to talk about experience, so we have to use words. But you're exactly right that what counts is our experience of God, not all that much about our words about God or how we describe it, because it'll be different for all of us.
Sure, and the issue you mentioned is very real on so many levels. Certainly, a lot of people will call me for coaching or write into me, and they're all very, or they grew up at some point conventionally Christian, and as they got to higher states, they stopped going to church.
Yes.
They just don't go to church anymore.
That's right.
And sometimes it's because the people won't really accept them completely or accept their experience. And that's another interesting topic as well. I was struck in Religion of Tomorrow by one little blurt Wilber had about if you have an awakening and you're firmly rooted in amber, which is, I guess, the more evangelical, traditional kind of rule role kind of structure stage of psychological development, if you have a waking up experience in that and you're firmly rooted in it, then there's a really good chance you're just going to stay in that that way of understanding for the rest of your life. And I thought that was interesting, because it was like, I mean, if you read that backwards, you might think maybe it's not a good idea for evangelicals to have subtle state experiences. And I'm curious about your thought on that.
Well, I think you're exactly right. In that traditional stage, what spiritual experiences, which are authentic and real, do, though, is they tend to be interpreted as, well, I've had this spiritual experience, therefore my theology and what I believe and the way I look at Christianity must be absolutely perfect and right, and anybody who doesn't agree with that just isn't spiritual. The spiritual experience, which is authentic, is then used to reinforce the idea that where I am in my belief system is all there is, and that's really unfortunate. And then that leads to people leaving the traditional stage and moving to the modern stage, where they kind of toss it all out for a while. And I know you have those people come to you too, and that's a great stage of growth, where you do toss it out and you have to rethink it. And then if the people hang in there long enough, it can move to postmodern. Marcus Borg is my favorite postmodern scholar, and begin to have spiritual experiences and interpret them in a more inclusive and light of a loving God who doesn't leave anybody behind and doesn't insist that everybody use the same language. They can sort of begin to grow again spiritually. And then I think Integral comes along and says, here's a way to integrate all those stages. That there's truth in the traditional stage, and there's also things that are less true, and we need to transcend them. And there's truth in the modern stage, and there's things that are not always true there, and we could transcend that, and so on up to the postmodern. The integral stage is the only stage where people aren't mad at the people at the other stages. You could tell people in the postmodern stage, they just hate the traditionalists and just hate the orthodox, and they just don't want to have any thing to do with those where they've come from. They've rejected all that. But the integral stage, you begin to say, well, you know what? I went through that traditional stage. Evidently, you have to be age 5 before you can be age 6. And there's nothing wrong with being 5 years old, as long as you're moving on towards being 6. And 5 is not being terrible. 5 is just being 5. And it's different than being 12 years old. And so we can begin to appreciate that each of those stages is an important part of our own spiritual growth, and begin to love people whatever stage they're in. I'm a great believer in stage rights. We have all kinds of human rights, and one of them is that everybody, including President Trump, has a right to be at the stage they're in. And they may be an amber or warrior stage or a traditional stage or a very literal angry stage. They've got a right to be there. That's the way we grow. We can't skip stages. We have to grow through them. And the further we move towards an integral stage, the more we see that, and we can say with Jesus on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That is, our stage is what allows us to see what we can see. And so each stage keeps us from seeing further things that are a greater truth. And so Jesus understood that, and so he understood the guys nailing him to the cross were only acting in their worldview, their traditional stage, and he didn't get mad at them about it. I think that's tremendous.
Sure, it is tremendous. I feel the problem comes with the overarching picture on some of this. With if the estimates of Wilber are right, as far as most of the world being in amber and then a little bit more being in and orange, then you basically have like the world population that developmentally at like age 11 or 12 right now, and that's an issue.
Well, it is, only that's the way evolution works. Evolution starts at the lowest rung and works on through. But what's the good news in that is it seems like, and I agree with Ken here, that when 10% of the population reaches the next stage, that's enough to be a tipping point. So, for instance, the Renaissance occurred with just a few families in Europe, and then spread. And the cultural creatives of the 1960s and now, which are about 25% of our population, are now influencing more and more people in the world. And so Ken estimates about 5% of this country is at integral, and when we get at 10%, that'll be a very influential 10%, which will help water and help fulfill and bless the other stages, so they can move on and we can move past the culture wars. But in the meantime, we're going to have culture clashes because people are at various stages, and the integral stage is the only one that says, well, let's see the value of each of these stages and see if we can't work out how to live together.
Well, that's a very noble perspective, and certainly very, very Christ-like. I'm curious about another aspect as far as when there is some awakening into subtle and causal or awakened consciousness, transcendent consciousness, oneness consciousness, as you call it. What happens when there's an awakening before the person is at the kind of integral structure stage, when the dam breaks open many years too soon, as King Floyd said?
Well, I think it's fine. It just means the person will interpret their awakening experience at the level of their stage. So they're having a genuine experience, which can be quite transforming, but it is best accompanied by further evolution in worldview or in stage growth. And so, for instance, I have Pentecostal friends who have real spiritual experiences, some of which I have too, but they want to interpret that as you've got to do it this way and that way, and this is the only way to do it, and so on. And I say, well, that's just the way. That's their worldview, and I'm glad they're having the spiritual experience, even though they're interpreting it from their worldview. It's better to be awake at a lower stage than to be at a higher stage and not awake. You could be developmentally stage-wise in a postmodern stage, but not have very many state experiences and not be very awake spiritually. So, are you familiar with the Wilber-Combs lattice?
Sure, with the center of gravity.
Yes. So what that says is that you can have a spiritual experience of a high quality at any stage, and the goal is to have it at the highest stage possible, because there you will interpret it more fully. And I know I have lots of spiritual experiences. I have visions and all sorts of things that go on, and I know that in 100 years I'll look back and say, well, that was wonderful, but you sure didn't see what was really going on, and you talked about it in a funny way. Because I'm just trapped by my worldview, which right now is integral, but there's a lot beyond integral, and so that's just where we live.
Sure. So I'm curious too. What do you think about Christianity being a conveyor belt of growth? Do you think that churches do you see any sort of vision for the future and churches or organizations within the Christian tradition being that conveyor belt? Do you see them doing cleaning up, shadow work? I mean, all of the above? I mean, where do we go?
Maybe. It seems like every 500 years there's a major shift in the institutional church, and I think we're at a 500-year period where the institutional church as we know it, the form of it, is not working very well. And I did my best for almost half a century with a wonderful group of people. But it was a very small percentage of those people that bought into what I was really trying to do. When Jesus told the story of the soils, the soils, the rocky soil and the soil that produced a lot, he was giving the workers a picture of reality and saying, don't get discouraged. You're at the best, you're going to have about 25% return. And so I think we're at a big shifting point in terms of church, and there needs to be new models of it. It took me, I found a group of people that were willing to change and grow with me when I would learn something new. But it took a long time, and not everybody has that amount of time. And so I think there are new forms of the church emerging via the internet and via a lot of study groups and centering prayer groups and other kinds of ways of doing church. And I think out of that will come new forms, and they will bring the new life, and the institutions that won't change will gradually, because they may be going for centuries, but the life will leave them. And so I think a new thing's emerging now, and we don't know what it is yet in terms of how the Christian church will look. But there's new forms going on all the time. I don't know. Do you go to a prayer group or a community group or a church?
No, I haven't been. I went to live at a monastery about 10 years ago and stayed there for about 6 months and wrestled with the idea of becoming a silent monk. And this is all under the Episcopal Church. Uh-huh. And, as much as I loved the monastery, it was kind of like after that, church fell a little flat. And so I basically met some partners online and kind of started Contemplative Light. It's kind of, not only to like kind of get the mystical tradition out there, but also for my own growth to kind of keep me connected. And now I'm an aspirant oblate at the monastery I went to, so I'm going through that process. So yeah, I'm just now kind of coming back into wanting something more engaged in some way.
Sure.
But it's certainly been my tendency is the hermit, by himself on the mountain.
That's wonderful. So what you're doing, you're doing two new forms of the church together. You're doing a very ancient hermit type monastery deal, or I have some friends who call themselves new monastics, and at the same time you're cultivating a internet community where you get to talk with people like we're talking here, and maybe some in a more regular way. And so you are a part of the integral movement to create this new space. And it's wonderful. You're going two directions at the same time that are almost the opposite directions, and so you're diving in at both levels, which I think is wonderful, because that's a rich mixture that you're involved in. That's good for you, Clint. That's wonderful.
Well, thank you. I feel really good hearing that. That feels really good to hear. That's certainly what I'd like to do, what I'd like it to be, and I certainly think that, this is the time. So, if I can help others and kind of live my own path, that's great, and still be within the Christian tradition. I certainly have been called a heretic many, many times, and so I'm sure you're familiar with that as well.
Yeah. Well, I love it that you're doing both of those things, one very ancient and one very, very new, all at the same time. I love it.
Well, thank you. Well, I love the work you're doing and getting it out there, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about your new book specifically, if you want to share.
Sure. Well, I'm trying to bring balance back into Christianity, and I think the three faces of God, that is, God beyond us, God beside us, and God being us, are all three profoundly important. And so I make a case for each of those, and also I make a case for spirit as seen as consciousness, and that's the substance of my book. And I quote the ancient monastics that you're very familiar with, and the early church fathers, as well as scientists and others today, as well as Bible scholars and my own scholarship. And I feel like it puts together two important things. One, the three faces of God, and then the spirit as consciousness, or awakened mystical consciousness and higher states. And I long for that balance, and I associate a lot with people who do centering prayer. And every time I'm with them, I want to say, this is great. But everybody was kind of doing their own inner meditation thing. That's really good. But could we do some second person stuff? For instance, could the leader of the group say, now it's time to talk to God, and why don't you experience? Jesus said he'd be with us all the time, and so he's here now, and why don't we talk to him? And why don't we listen for what he says back? And then not only that, why don't we do that with one another? Why don't we listen to God's words for one another? And I have a new group that I just started. We meet every other week, and it's a very experienced meditators. And I call it our We Space group. And so when we get together, the group easily moves into causal transcendent consciousness. And when we're there for a while, then we move into the energy field that's between us. We move into the we space, and we rest in that, and then we end up acting like a bunch of charismatics. We put a chair in the center, and we each sit in the chair, and everybody puts their hands on us and prays for us. And we some of the people in the group have a gift of channeling words from spirit, higher consciousness, and other people have other gifts that come alive then, and it's very invigorating, very inspiring, and it brings together both the contemplative and the charismatic, both the first person space and the second person space, and we find it a refreshing combination. So it isn't just meditation, and it isn't just prayer. progressive form, not the traditional prayer. And it's entering into an energy field that's created by Jesus' presence and our presence in moving into higher states of consciousness. And it's very exciting, very exciting.
You know, one
Are you
specific. There? Yeah, I am here. Just taking it all in. One specific question I've always been curious about, and I've never had really a good answer other than the answer of finding my way through it, which is probably all I really need. But as far as the causal state or the transcendent consciousness, there's kind of a level of universal archetypes that comes up, and Wilber talks about the idea that you can get overly attached to one archetype, that like you mentioned, balance. The idea is to balance in the midst of all archetypes. And one thing I struggled with as a Christian was the Christ archetype, in the causal state. And it's like, am I supposed to be equally balanced between Christ, Buddha, and Shiva, at that causal state? And then, wow, you see the predicament there?
Sure. I think what we are called to do, I really agree with Ken, is to dig deep in whatever tradition we came to the party in, whatever tradition that was, to dig deeply in that, and then we find ourselves able to see the truth and the wisdom and the love and higher spiritual awareness in these other places, and we can drink from those wells if we want to also. But it's not a matter of balancing the channel or the archetypes. It's a matter of finding the archetypes that fit for you, and usually they're the ones that we grew up with. We don't live long enough to be able to dig deep into many different ones. And so, to me, Jesus is wonderful. And I probably, if I was a Buddhist, I'd think the same thing about Buddha, and I'd be a ardent Buddhist who'd be saying these same things and saying it's okay to be a Buddhist and learn from Jesus. But we don't have to be balanced in the sense of holding all those perspectives in the same depth and degree of devotion and knowledge, because we don't have enough of a lifetime to do that. And so I think, matter of fact, there's a psychologist who has found that that people who are suffering from stress and trauma spiritually don't really get that resolved until they go back to their original spiritual source, like maybe traditional Christianity. And
wow,
they make peace with that.
That's important. Yeah, that's really important.
And they make peace with that because that's the place for their own psyche that has the most powerful archetypes and the most powerful symbols. And as they make peace with that and get the healing they need, then they're free, if they choose to move on to some other realm, or to stay in that tradition that they're in, but just live it out at a higher stage and a higher level. And I think that's just really true. We need to be healed in the tradition that we came from, make peace with it, and then we're free to whatever our bent is. And your bent is to the monastic and the hermit bent, which is wonderful. That's just wonderful. And at the same time, here you are having these wonderful conversations with people all over the world, and so you're putting together the things that fit for you. And I think you're doing it just great. It's very inspiring.
Well, thanks for your encouragement. It is much appreciated. I'm curious though, digging deeper off of what you said. So if we may not need to balance between multiple traditions, it seems like we would need to balance between light and shadow. And the shadow in Christianity is a little extreme. If you think of the shadow as Satan, that's some severe balancing act. How do you integrate the shadow and or understand that kind of element in Christianity without making it into eternal hell?
Sure. Well, there's two approaches. One is a theoretical approach, and the other is an experiential approach. Theoretically, I think evolution of any kind, biological or spiritual evolution, only occurs in the midst of destruction. So some things have to be destroyed before new things can arise. I have a woman in my former congregation who's quite a seeker, and her hero, her idol is Kali, the Hindu god of destruction, and she just finds great relief in owning the destructive part of growth and evolution, and I think she's got a point there. Now that's the theoretical part. On the experiential part, I'm a great believer not only in the 1, 2, 3 of God, but the 3, 2, 1 of shadow work. I practice that form of cleaning up. I guess Ken's calling it cleaning up now. A shadow work where when I become aware of shadow in myself, when I notice the bad thing in somebody else but don't see it in myself, I do a 3, 2, 1. I get it out and talk about it and think about it, and then I talk to it, and then I own it into myself so that it dissolves into me and is resolved and no longer becomes a projection. So I think what we have to do with shadow is if it's a dark shadow, we own it, and if it's a golden shadow, and the golden shadow is what people do with Jesus. They take their own divinity and project it out onto Jesus and make him the only divine Son of God there is, and that's a projection. And what Jesus wants to do is he wants to show us that we're like him, and we have to become who we really are in that deep, true self-identity as equal co-heirs with Jesus. And so we take back our divinity and then relate to Jesus as an elder brother. So I think the shadow work is a very important thing, and some people need therapy for that. That's a good way to do it. It's a little hard for some people. It's so deep that the 3, 2, 1 process is not accessible to them.
Sure, and I feel like it's only natural to have your own kind of residue mixed up with Jesus, especially having heard it for the first time so young, and all of us, most of us, probably having some developmental shifts that never quite happened as clean as possible,
Right. Yes, that's the great challenge of second-person spirituality and a prayer, which is to take care of the projections, especially when we're talking to Jesus or we're talking to God as mother or father or however we image God, and to try to own the projections that we have in that and get them back into us so that we're claiming our full power and our own divinity in every way, which is what Jesus came to model for us. he came to model what it looks like to be a full human divine being, a spiritual being on a human journey. And so that's who we are. That's who you are on the inside. You are already that. You don't need to seek it. You are already made in God's image, a child of God, and a Christ inside, a perfect being of light. And the goal is just to let that identity emerge, which can happen in meditation and union, and then we stop projecting that onto others.
Yes. Well, it's been just absolutely wonderful having you on, and I hope we can do it again at some point. And like I mentioned, I'm going to post some book reviews in the upcoming future on your book on our site at Contemplative Light. And do you want to tell people about where to find you?
I hope you do, because Clint, you're a wonderful interviewer, and you have a wonderful, rich spiritual background, and so I really would be interested in what you think about my new book, and I hope I can access your review or get a copy of it. And for anybody listening that wants to connect with me, my website is Paul's is www.revpaulsmith.com. RevPaulSmith.com, one word, RevPaulSmith.com. And that's the way to get hold of me.
Great. Well, yeah, and I will stay in touch and keep you posted when not only this interview goes up there, but when book reviews and yeah, I mean it's just great having you on, great talking to you, and just a real honor, and I'm so grateful for kind of all you've done for Christianity, really.
Well, thank you, Clint, and it's inspiring to talk and to be with you. I feel your warm and gracious and generous spirit, even here over the phone. So I hope our paths cross again many times.
Likewise. All right, well, take care.